Amen. Well, I have a parable to tell you. There was once a straight, upper middle class white guy named Guy, and a lesbian, upper middle class white woman named Louise. They didn't know each other, but they lived in the same city. Guy prided himself on being a red-blooded American. He drove a big, gas-guzzling truck. It made him feel masculine. This was after scientists had realized what carbon was doing to the atmosphere. But any time he heard about global warming, he just wrote it off. Conspiracy theories, fake news. Louise prided herself on being crunchy, or at least that's the kind of image she tried to cultivate. She drove her Prius everywhere, trying to do her part to save the environment. Well, maybe it was mostly to save face with the other crunchy people, but you know. Maybe in the back of her mind, she knew that her small reduction in carbon emissions would hardly make a dent in global warming, and that the money she spent on that car might have had a bigger impact if put towards legislation or policy change or even education. But she needed that street cred among the green living folks. Guy shopped every week at Walmart. Smart shopping, he called it. Though he was quite well off, he could never see a reason to pay more for the same stuff. Now, this was after best-selling books like The Walmart Effect, How the World's Most Powerful Company Really Works and How It's Transforming the American Economy, or documentaries like Walmart, The High Cost of the Low Price had come out. But he hadn't paid any of that much attention. Louise shopped only at health food stores. She paid a premium for organic produce and meat. She told herself it was for the farm workers so they didn't have to work in all those pesticides, for the earth that was being polluted. But really, if she was honest, she just didn't want to eat them herself. She never really noticed the lack of racial diversity of those who shopped and worked at the stores she frequented. Now, Louise, she dressed in clothes that looked quite worn. She liked people to think that she shopped at thrift stores. But she really bought stone-washed designer clothes made to look secondhand that cost hundreds of dollars. She justified it to herself, saying it was organic cotton and she was supporting local shops. Yes, when the local homeless shelter asked her for a donation, she said she couldn't afford it. Maybe she could have if she had shopped at those thrift shops. Now, sometimes Guy went to Walmart by himself. More often, he sent his housekeeper, Maria. He always patted himself on the back a little bit that he paid her almost minimum wage, when he could easily get away with paying less. It was all under the table, after all. He paid his gardeners a little less than her, but he was still paying more than his neighbors paid them. He considered himself a do-getter and was very proud of his charitable wages. He didn't see the way those families were barely getting by to put a roof over their heads or food on the table. How they worked several jobs, low-paying, all under the table, of course. Guy would watch the news in the evenings about immigrants they were catching at the border. When he saw their faces on TV, he would shout in his head and sometimes out loud, "Criminals, lawbreakers, deport them. Learn English, you fools. Clean up your own country, don't come ruin mine." Of course, he didn't realize that the face staring back at him on the TV one night was his housekeeper Maria's ill, aging father, trying to come live with her so she could care for him. And of course, he didn't realize the politics and the actions of his own country that had created an environment of fear and violence from which Maria and now her father were fleeing. He liked Maria. He liked his landscapers. But they were the exception to the rule, he thought, different than all those other rotten, lazy immigrants. Louise considered herself woke. She was a proud feminist. She had read The New Jim Crow. She acknowledged, or rather gave lip service at least, to understanding her white privilege. Whether she did or not is really a whole other matter. She showed up at Black Lives Matter rallies, even served on their planning committees. She prided herself on contributing a lot and being really active in the group. She didn't realize how many times she had interrupted and silenced a black woman in the group. How many times her need to lead had taken away from someone else's opportunity to lead. Nor did she realize that when black men and women in the group did actually get a chance to share their experiences with her, her response usually was one of white fragility, needing them to affirm for her that when they were talking about the problems of whiteness and white people, they weren't talking about her. She wasn't like all the rest of them. She wasn't racist. At their protests, she would carry her sign, "What if this was your son?" No, she didn't really have any black friends, but she cared about their lives. She didn't even notice how she clutched her purse to her when a young 12-year-old black boy went walking by her on the street. She would have guessed he was 17. When the cops showed up at the Black Lives Matter marches, she instantly felt safer. After all, they're not all bad. And she knew even if they were, she was prepared for civil disobedience. She would risk arrest. She didn't realize the fear that rose in Cynthia, the black woman standing next to her, at the sight of those cops. She didn't see the way Cynthia turned and whispered in her teenage son's ear, "Be careful, do just what they say." Occasionally, when Guy would go to Walmart by himself, Guy would get to the register and he would shake his head as he watched people pull out their food stamps. One day, he rolled his eyes at a young African-American mom, Lorinda. She was pulling out her food stamps and her two kids were crying and whining as she tried to check out. He felt for her, probably a single mom. But come on, he thought, teach your kids some manners, get a job, quit living off the government. He glared at her. He didn't recognize her as the same woman who had checked him out at that very register earlier that week. Now, Louise and her partner moved out of the inner city to the suburbs when they had kids. They bought a house in an up-and-coming neighborhood that was still a little rough around the edges. They didn't even think about the fact that they were part of white flight. When they moved in, there was a complex of Section 8 housing right behind their fence. It was dingy and run down, a total eyesore. It needed a paint job. There were broken toys and trash scattered on the ground around it. Louise always locked her doors whenever she drove by that complex, and she wondered often whether her children were really safe in that neighborhood. Luckily, it had since been bought up by a big property development company and demolished, so they could put up much nicer units. Units there, only 500 square feet, rented for $1,500 a month. The city claimed the complex was part of their work to clean up the city, provide more affordable housing. Louise certainly felt safer. When a local nonprofit was vying to open their homeless shelter down the block, she feared the same kind of thing, and she signed a petition online quietly blocking it. Even though she believes in caring for the poor, votes for tax hikes to do so, she really doesn't want the poor in her own backyard. She rejoiced when her property value went up at the demolition of that old complex. She had bought into the city's narrative about providing more affordable housing. She hadn't met the Browns, who had lived there in a tiny apartment in that old complex. They now lived in their car, because the 100 units of Section 8 housing that had been there had gone down to 10 units of affordable housing in the new complex. And this family was back on the Section 8 waiting list. Well, standing in line at that Walmart watching Lorinda and her 2 young boys, Guy wondered, where's the father of these 2 boys? Thought to himself, probably some lazy druggie or a gangbanger. You see, Guy had bought into the media coverage that for years has shown African American males as violent criminals or the source of the drug problem. What Guy didn't know was that, yes, Lorinda's husband was indeed in jail, but not for a crime he had committed. He was walking home one day when a nearby convenience store had been robbed. Police had been alerted, an African American male on foot. So when they saw Jerome 2 streets over, walking home from work, they assumed he was the thief. They jumped out of the car, startling the young man. Instinctively, he started to run, which made him look even more guilty. They tackled him to the ground. When he tried to tell them he didn't do anything, they shoved him back into the ground, slammed him down so hard that blood started gushing from his forehead. Jerome couldn't afford a private lawyer, so he was assigned an overworked public defender who took one look at him and decided he was guilty. When a plea deal came in, 3 years in prison, his public defender encouraged him to take it, scaring him with the possibilities of potentially a much longer sentence if he went to trial, and if he didn't convince the jury that he was innocent. Pretty difficult task as a young black man in America. So Jerome accepted the plea deal, pled guilty, and now was not at Walmart on this evening when his wife and 2 boys were shopping and being judged by Guy. Guy believed in the war on drugs that was going to clean up the inner cities. When Guy pictured drug dealers, he pictured Latino and African American gang members. He didn't know that his white next-door neighbor, Paul, in his nice suburban neighborhood, was running a meth lab in his own home. Of course, Paul was never even suspected by the police when they pulled him over for speeding. They never searched his Mercedes carrying thousands of dollars worth of drugs. They never put their hand on their holster. They even joked with him, complimented him on his car. When Guy later did find out that Paul had some addiction issues, Guy and his wife wrote a card wishing Paul well in recovery. It seems Guy wanted the war on drugs, except when it came next door to someone he knew and cared about. Now, the schools in their neighborhood weren't very great, so Louise and her partner, they sent their kids to private school. Even though they believed in public education, they weren't about to sacrifice their own kids' education to invest in it. Recently, however, the district had stopped busing from other neighborhoods as part of the desegregation plan. And between that and the Section 8 housing being demolished, the school in their neighborhood improved dramatically. Now, on a philosophical level, Louise knew that she should be concerned about not desegregating, concerned about the schools in black neighborhoods that were failing. But secretly, she was glad she could send her kids to public school again and stop paying private school tuition. Guy was a good Christian. He listened only to Christian music. Guy went to church every Sunday. He gave to his church generously, even volunteered in their food pantry. Helping people made him feel good, like he was needed. Playing Savior was such a big part of his faith expression. Now, perhaps, if he had ever stopped to consider it, he might have wondered what he would do if there were not poor people to serve, if the systemic issues that created poverty were solved. Where would he derive his meaning? But any thoughts that even bordered on that were quickly eased when he remembered Jesus had said, "You will always have the poor with you." Phew. Louise had never been to church in her life. Religion was the root of most of the evil in the world, she thought. She turned up her nose at people who had too much faith. Hypocrites, she would sneer. She didn't see or understand her own hypocrisy. Nor did she see the look of utter relief and joy on Arnold's face at the AA meeting down the street when he first discovered the gospel and a higher power who loves him and forgives him. Despite her lack of religion, she still tried to be an activist. She showed up at all sorts of rallies, and she volunteered at a number of nonprofits. When Guy died, God showed him all of the unseen things he hadn't seen or acknowledged while he was living. I looked across a vast chasm and saw God there with Maria and her family, with Lorinda and Jerome, with all those people living in poverty in his city who Guy had judged. God helped him to see into every part of their life, all the parts he had refused to see. God made him look with God's own love and compassion on these people. And Guy's heart broke. His guilt haunted him. The chasm between him and God, between him and all these people who he had harmed, was so great. When Louise died, she also looked across a great chasm. And God, too, took her on a tour of her life, opened her eyes to her own hypocrisy. He showed her inside Cynthia's fear. He showed her inside the Browns' makeshift home in their car. He showed her how much her money could have helped if she hadn't been so concerned about cultivating her image. Or if she had just stood inside instead of hogging the spotlight. She was too overwhelmed to take it in, just like Guy. Even though God forgave both Guy and Louise, they couldn't forgive themselves. And that chasm was so big. That chasm they had created, that disparity. They kept uttering the repeated refrain, "If only I had known. If only I had known." The one thing they both asked God was to let them go back, tell their family and their friends, the people they love. He told them they already have books and films and documentaries and experts and world leaders. They're all showing them all that you know, but they won't listen. God even told them that both of them, Guy and Louise, had had all the tools that they needed to know all of this while they were living. If only they had paid attention and changed. Friends, I have a feeling that when we meet God, we too will sing that refrain, "If only I had known." Sometimes we really don't know about the injustices and the microaggressions in which we're participating. You go to the store and very intentionally pick out what you think is an ethical t-shirt, and it turns out to have been made by kids in a sweatshop. Sometimes we really don't know. But a lot of the time, if we're honest, we do. We have been told what is needed for peace on earth, and we ignore it. We go about doing our own thing because we don't want to change, because it's easy, because it's convenient, because we don't want it to cost us too much. The good news is God forgives us. The hard news is God challenges us to do better, to open our eyes now to the ways we are holding others down or not being merciful and just. So today, on this Labor Day weekend, I challenge you to your own labor and my own labor. Whether you resonated more with Guy or with Louise or a little bit of both, may you take an honest look in the mirror and let God hold you in all of your goodness and all of your brokenness, and remake you each day into someone who embodies Christ's love and justice and mercy a little more fully and a little more fully and a little more fully. May it be so. Amen.